and we are ready to go.
Okay, welcome everybody to day 3, the afternoon for the Digital Transformation in Government 2023. This afternoon we have a presentation from Dr. Kimiz Dalkir, who's the Director of Information Studies at McGill University. So for this one, the history of knowledge management is often categorized into 3 early eras. The first focused on knowledge management containers. And so those are the tools and technologies, or the what of knowledge management, to ensure the valuable knowledge could be shared with present-day colleagues, as well as in the future, which is often an unknown. So in terms of knowledgeable reusers. The second era focused on knowledgeable people, or the who of knowledge management, to create knowledge networks to help identify who possessed what type of expertise within the organization, and sometimes outside it. The third era focused on the content, and more importantly, being able to find valuable content when it was needed. The growing interdisciplinarity of knowledge management and its symbiotic relationship with big data, analytics, and artificial intelligence. The need for greater knowledge sharing in the wake of 9/11, a new ISO, a knowledge management standard, and how the role of knowledge management became much more visible during the pandemic. What's next, and what are the current trends? Some key trends include knowledge management governance, metrics, roles and competencies, integration with AI, and more scalable knowledge management and more inclusive knowledge management. I welcome very much Dr. Dalkir, and I'm going to hand things over for you to present. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what's going on in the post-truth world that we find ourselves in, and some ways in which knowledge management can hopefully help us out. Okay, sorry, I'll just get that one off. So very briefly, I'm going to talk to you. I'm sure you all know what fake news is by now. A little bit about the history, because it's really not anything new, and the different roles that can be played by literacy campaigns, policies and legislation. And then, of course, my emphasis here is on, well, how can KM and perhaps KM together with artificial intelligence help? And we'll conclude with some recommendations, which are really some discussion points to share with you. I had the opportunity to edit this book with my doctoral student, Rebecca Katz, that you see on there, and our timing, it wasn't intentional, but it came out, I believe, late February, early March 2020. So, of course, although we had sort of addressed fake news in general, it really all became, it was all about fake news during the pandemic, which of course happened as well. Right, so let's take a look at post-truth. Post-truth is it's a very interesting era that we are living through, and interesting is one of those words that could be negative or positive. We are really looking at interesting behaviors, and in our field we refer to this as information behavior or information seeking behavior. Like, how do people find what they're looking for when they have a question to be answered or a problem to be solved? And in the post-truth world, we are actually seeing behaviors where people, perhaps consciously, deliberately, perhaps not, are very much seeking out facts that support what they already believe. So the Oxford Dictionary called this a public burial of objective facts by an avalanche of media that appeals to emotion and personal belief. And this is sometimes referred to as confirmation bias. And, it's all about staying in your comfort zone. Once we've kind of figured out and made sense of the world around us, we kind of like staying there. And if we have a fact or a proof or evidence that really negates what we have already comfortably built as a mental model, well, it's actually, there's a term for that. We call it information avoidance. We kind of push that away and only let in what confirms what we've already decided to be true. And as I said at the overview, this is nothing new. It really isn't. There is something that's new, however, and that is the internet, social media, and these have made it possible for fake news and valid news to really have a worldwide reach that's almost instantaneous. So this is what makes it a challenging time to be in right now in post-truth. And this is from the BBC that had a really nice sort of timeline of post-truth. And so before 2000, really we're talking about things like gossip, rumors. Some of you may be familiar with the radio broadcast that was done for the War of the Worlds, and people took it to be real. But as we go through, you know, it really, of course, predates any technology, as political rhetoric was, you know, rife with all sorts of invalid claims from really very much the beginning. What happened, though, is that as technologies changed from one-to-many communications to network, seemed to really collide during the US elections, where there was just a huge proliferation of online fake news, even though as there were, for example, presidential debates that were broadcast, there was actual real-time fact-checking. And then that's where we saw how strong that phenomenon of confirmation bias was, where people just negated it. And then we saw, as things evolved a little bit, we began to see that we have started with some legislation, which I'll talk to you about, and of course the first fact checkers. And then of course the pandemic hit. So let me see if I can make sure you can see everything. Okay, there we go. So as I said, what's different today is, of course, the technology, the speed, the reach, but also information overload. There are just so many channels that are pushing information at us in real time. It's just information overload has become, I mean, we've always had it, again, it's just become just unbearable. That coupled with avoiding certain types of information that doesn't sort of mesh with what we already believe. And then you subtract from that, I sort of made my little mathematical summary there, and subtract from that time, like we have no time. Well, those are the conditions for a perfect storm that created the post-truth world that we find ourselves in. We are now seeing a phenomenon where we're really no longer getting the majority of our news from valid sort of mass media, journals, television news. Most people get it from some kind of social media like Facebook. And this, of course, fosters groupthink. So it's really, it's a vicious circle, right? It is a circle. We're within our group of people, and we're sharing what we just got and what we believe in. And this actually dates back to a fairly classic theory in psychology called repetition theory, which is a very simple theory. And it is simply that the more we hear something, the more we're likely to believe it. And this is also in parallel with so-called filter bubbles or echo chambers. And this is where we are now beginning to just live in our own bubble, where we are sharing, liking, consuming news from people that are probably very similar to us, similar in personality and political belief and so forth. So this is really all of the some of the key variables that have created the post-truth world. And then, of course, AI can compound this. I'm sure you've noticed this if you look something up, maybe on Facebook or social media, or it could be even Google. There are algorithms that look, of course, that are looking at what you're looking at, and then they will try to push similar content to you. So I don't know if you looked at something like a destination to go to for a beach or hiking boots, then all of a sudden you're getting ads and articles disguised as ads popping up in your filter bubble. So you're all familiar by now that AI can generate fake news. The problem is, again, the speed and the sophistication level that we've gotten to with this is just amazing. So it used to be just producing fake text, fake headlines, fake news items. So these are read fakes. Then we got into the multimedia, where we have very believable photos and videos. And this is not just the general public. So I think this is something that's important to point out. Most people, I think, mistakenly believe that, oh no, well, you know, the higher your education level, the less vulnerable you are to this. Well, even cybersecurity experts can be tricked. They have become very, very sophisticated. I see something in the chat. I'll check the chat in a second. And then, of course, we have ChatGPT, which is generative AI. And again, I'm sure you're familiar with this. It is now actually trickling down to all sorts of things. It's actually going to affect how we find information because Google is going to use very similar technology to answer your search queries. So if you enter something into Google, this is not yet released in Canada, as far as I know, as of last week when I checked. So let's say you're looking for information on where's a good place to go hiking in Ontario or Quebec. And you will get short summaries for your search. So what's happening is those summaries are going to be generated by a ChatGPT-like algorithm. And what most people will do is they will just read the summaries and that's it. They will not click on the source. They will not read the actual article that was retrieved. So this is really going a bit further than before. So I will now talk a little bit about the role of information and media literacy. This has been our classical approach to helping people deal with misinformation, disinformation, fake news. These are not all synonyms, by the way. A lot of it has to do with whether or not there is an intent to deceive, intent to commit fraud, identity theft, steal money, or influence the results of a political campaign. So the perception most people have, however, is that the content is benign. It's like, what's the big deal? What is the consequence? Maybe I got fooled. So there's a lot of factors that make us very vulnerable to it. And I mentioned earlier the time, right? So checking to see if something is in fact true. So most of our information literacy efforts have been to increase awareness, provide education and training, even trying to make the learning of this fun by creating games and having people do things like, all right, so you've read something, so what should you do? You should check to see if the same item is being reported by more than one source. You should Google the name of the author and make sure they have a credible profile online. But all of this requires time and effort. Not a lot, but it still requires time and effort. Whereas reading the cool, splashy headline requires almost no effort, especially if it was pushed to you through your filter bubble and you don't even, it's right there. It just pops up. You don't have to do anything. So there is a kind of a laziness and, we just don't have enough time. Also, we like to think we're very, very rational beings. And of course, human behavior is not, of course, 100% rational. And if something was shared with us from someone that we trust and we have a relationship with, well, then sure, it's much easier to just believe it so we don't check it, even though there are fact-checking websites out there. So one of the things we did, and we benefited from the Canadian Digital Citizenship Project with Heritage Canada. We got some funding and we did a research project that we finished just a few months ago, really, and we looked at could we inoculate? This is a term that we use referring to increasing awareness, using the health metaphor. Can we inoculate people against fake news, help them become less vulnerable? And we looked particularly at marginalized youth in Quebec as they are more vulnerable. And we created a mobile phone app because that's all this age group uses, just mobile phones. Not to make phone calls, of course, just text and searching the web. And we looked at how we could help. And we found that it was, in fact, possible to have some degree of success with this inoculation. It was essentially an interactive workshop. We tried to make it engaging and fun. We found that this kind of active participation did help. One of the problems is how long the effect lasts, and it doesn't last that long. So it's not to say information literacy is not effective. It is. I think the key finding that, not just us, that most of the community is coming to is we do need efforts along literacy, but literacy alone is not enough. we need to do something else. So, and also we need to go beyond just information literacy, which, as I mentioned earlier, traditionally has been check credibility of sources, triangulate, increase critical reasoning skills, publicize how to spot fakes, and so forth. But it's really not just a single monolithic literacy. It's turning out to be multiple types of different literacies. News literacy is something on its own, digital literacy, and then of course multimedia like text and so forth. Your objective in searching, are you just browsing, wasting time, doom scrolling, or are you looking for health information in order to make a decision about your own health care? There's so many variables that a simple sort of high level generic approach to literacy is not going to be sufficient. So what else can we do? Well, there's definitely a role to be played by governments in terms of legislation and organizations, including social media companies, in terms of information policies. Unfortunately, this has been a little bit hit or miss. Most social media have rules on misinformation. They're not particularly clear. They are not consistent. It's very different across different platforms. There was a recent analysis by Consumer Reports that looked at the major social media platforms, and they focused on where there was more serious consequences, such as misinformation on how to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, or information on how to vote, or misinformation on how to vote. So most do ban certain kinds of misinformation and have rules against posting false materials. The biggest drawback, of course, is enforcement. And where do we venture into that gray area where we're now impeding free speech? So here's an example from TikTok, as just a screenshot from their website. So, when you read through this, it sounds, again, very, very good, right? So it's, do not incite hate or prejudice. You cannot post medical misinformation that will harm someone's physical health, cannot mislead people about how to participate in elections or any other civic process, anything that's around conspiracy theories, denying that a violent or tragic event occurred, which would be like the Holocaust deniers, so forth. So it's there. I mean, it's a bit like those privacy policies, and you don't need to put your hands up or be public about this. But when I ask my students, or I ask my colleagues and myself, to be quite honest, I don't always read the policies. And of course, what happens if the policies are there and people don't follow them? So you could take down content, and I'm sure you're aware of the recent controversies around that. So at what point does taking down content become censorship? Won't go into too much detail, but just to give you an idea of the diversity here on on what's sort of policies are out there. This is probably already out of date. I don't know what people are using now. I think is Instagram on there. There's it comes and goes. But again, the idea is just to say it's not consistent, of course, because these are all different entities. So there is no global information policy that can apply to all of them. And the biggest issue occurs in enforcement. How much is enough? How much is too little? How much is too much? And of course, who decides? So there are some recent changes. YouTube has recently said that they will stop deleting false 2020 election claims, but they will continue to remove references to any election fraud on how to vote in 2024. I'm not sure how to interpret that, but that's what they said. So now there's also a parallel movement to, one way to overcome misinformation and fake news might be to have some kind of a visible certification, saying, okay, this is certified to be true. The Meta started testing this in Canada, actually, and you pay for it. So basically you pay, Meta verifies you. Typically they ask you to provide some government issued ID. So here they have verified that you are who you say you are. And if you pay approximately $20 a month, then they will display this blue check mark on anything that you post. Well, that's one sort of trend that's happening recently. So that's information policy. What about legislation? So again, subject to the same issues and potential pitfalls. It's again this balance between taking down content that can have harmful consequences without impinging on free speech. The biggest problem around legislation has been a lack of clear definition and consensus on what is fake news exactly. And then the legal, of course, the legal domain has a requirement that we have to prove that there was malicious intent. So it's very difficult. And of course, depending on the country, this can easily lead to abuse and jailing of people who hold particular views or political views that the prevailing government just doesn't like. So what's been going on in terms of legislation is media literacy campaigns, task forces, government sponsored fact-checking sites where you can not only check your news, but you can also report fake news. There's a lot of work going on to create databases of fake news content as they are created. But as you can imagine, that's pretty heavy. It's a high volume. And using AI to help. I mean, AI, of course, creates fake news, but it can also help to detect fake news. I'll talk about that a little bit later. So I think the first one, and I'm happy to be corrected if I'm wrong here, but as far as I could tell by looking and researching this, the first sort of law came into effect in 2018 in Germany. And they really targeted this to social media, so social networks with more than 2 million members. So this would be Facebook, YouTube, Twitter at the time. And they immediately got into some issues. So you may already be aware of this. So it is easy to use our approaches, including algorithms, to detect fake news. One of the things that's really hard, even sometimes for humans, is to distinguish satire. So what happened was the magazine, a satirical magazine called Titanic, published something that was banned from Twitter. And even the Minister of Justice had his tweet censored because he was posting satire. So there was, they revised it a bit following the criticism, but it is really hard to legislate in that gray area. This was followed at around the same time. France particularly targeted fake news in the 3 months preceding any kind of vote or during an election. So there they gave legislative or judicial power to, so a judge had the power to remove fake content, and they had to do so within 48 hours of being notified that this was fake news, definitely targeted at trying to influence the elections. So again, this was hard because of satire. So they ended up saying, penalizing people that were publishing satire. They had to amend again their legislation to talk about manipulation of information. But again, no easy solution to that gray area. Singapore was the latest, but has a very, very comprehensive one. However, they've been getting a lot of criticism in that they are being accused of limiting free speech. So this one, you can see on the screen, has very, very specific and significant fines and prison sentences. But again, the enforcement part is, who gets to decide what happened. And there's some criticism there that certain types of opinions are being suppressed, and that it's not necessarily fake news, it's just, opinions that the government does not agree with. In the US, so far, we've seen only at the state level some legislation that introduced sort of mandatory media literacy in public schools. This is actually personally, I think this is a good approach. We talked about literacy earlier. The problem with literacy today in this post-truth world is we tend to try to do it after the fact. So we find people who've been vulnerable or who got scammed, and we're saying, okay, here, let's teach you what to do. Obviously, it would be much better, even though there's a time lag before this has impact, if we start teaching students fairly early on, right? So we teach literacy skills in the educational system. And some people are saying this should start in elementary school, right? In the K9 years, as early as possible to help them increase the awareness. And there's a couple of states that have passed similar bills that do this. In Canada, we have had to date, and again, there's new things happening a little bit with recently about online news, but Bill C-76 really required tech companies to be more transparent about their anti-disinformation and advertising policies. There's a critical election incident public protocol that monitors and notifies the public and agencies about any disinformation attempts that have been detected. I talked about the public awareness and the $7 million in projects that were given out to increase, research in this area. The FQRSC in Quebec recently launched a call for research proposals as well to combat misinformation, specifically in Quebec. So we have our digital charter where we want to defend freedom of expression, but at the same time, we don't want, we want to do something about disinformation. So the intent is there. It's not clear exactly what specific actions we will be taking in Canada. And our Prime Minister implied there would be meaningful penalties for non-compliance. But again, as we saw with other countries, this is not easy to do. It's not easy to enforce these kinds of legislative rules. And again, we don't have a clear definition or a clear way of detecting what is fake news, and fake news with a malicious, deliberate intent to cause harm. So that was a little bit of a whirlwind tour there of the legislation. Now I sort of spend a little bit of time on how can we see the role of knowledge management and knowledge management together with artificial intelligence helping. So again, in the book that I edited, we had chapters from all three areas. And our overall conclusion was we need all of these pieces to work together. So we need efforts in literacy, we need efforts in information policy and legislation, and maybe we can also use tools, technologies, and strategies like knowledge management and AI to help. So knowledge management is, as you know, a sort of a whole bunch of things. It touches on a strategy, it touches on technology, it touches on leadership. There's a lot of the role played by organizational culture and processes, as well as the governance that goes on within KM. So the idea is we could perhaps use some components of knowledge management and artificial intelligence algorithms to help people have more tools in their toolkit so that they can be able to trust or be able to assess the credibility and trustworthiness of content. So KM processes have always been used at all three levels: individual, group, and organizational. More recently, and I'll talk about that more in my other talk on the sort of trends in the future of KM, more recently, and especially because of the pandemic, we've seen that knowledge management needs to also operate at a societal and global level. But I thought for today's talk, I would just focus on one KM researcher, McElroy, who came up with a specific KM model, a process model, because I think it's the one that fits very well with trying to detect fake news. So he really created a conceptual model that can be easily implemented, where he says, when we're managing organizational knowledge, and we do this, of course, to increase efficiency, leverage what we've already learned in terms of best practices and lessons learned, we want to use it to catalyze more innovation. There's a variety of things we can do with knowledge management. But McElroy cautions us to say that any kind of content in knowledge management should first be viewed as a knowledge claim. And we need to validate this. We need to investigate. Is it in fact a good best practice, for example? Is it applicable everywhere, or are there limits to where we can apply it? Does a best practice have an expiry date? You know, like if new technology or something else changes in the landscape of the organization, are there conditions under which this is no longer the best way of doing something? And only then do we recommend that this be used throughout the organization. So very briefly, this is the McElroy KM process model here. And you see where the beliefs, he sees knowledge entering any KM system as a series of competing knowledge claims. And this is a very useful way of looking at what we do in knowledge management. So in other words, we tend to accept all input as people sort of contribute to it, and we want to encourage people to contribute to it. We have always had in the KM cycle a validation process, but this goes kind of one step further and says everything should really be sort of a claim until we can go a little further. And I was intrigued, and in sort of looking more closely at what McElroy did and where McElroy comes from. So this is interesting. I did not know this. And if there are Scots in the audience, I apologize, because I know you know this, but I did not know this. So McElroy is Scottish. And in the Scottish justice system, there are actually 3 possible outcomes of any court case, right? So we're really used to guilty, not guilty, but they have a not proven as a potential outcome. And really, as the phrase says, it just means that, well, we don't know. Like we did not have enough evidence to say that this is true or not true. And this is very useful for a knowledge claim. So at the very minimum of having these 3 categories, and maybe in the KM world, this would be, well, we're not sure. And actually this fits in well, because we have also noticed that more and more people prefer to not use the term best practice, but to use the term proven practice. So here we could have unproven practice. It's not necessarily bad. It's not necessarily malicious fake news, but we don't know. We don't have enough evidence to know. So it goes into a different category, a different bin, where we need to maybe investigate it more, or maybe seek out some trusted users to see and get their feedback and say, well, what do you think? Does this work? So this is, I think, a really good model that would fit really well. And then what role can AI play? Well, again, this is my sort of personal viewpoint, my own background. Actually, before knowledge management was artificial intelligence, back in the Jurassic age of AI. And I always felt that, you know, any technology, any algorithm can be used for good or for bad. And AI is very good at creating fake news, fake content. ChatGPT is fast. It's believable, it's good, it makes tons of mistakes, but AI is also something that could help us. So there are a lot of researchers that are reverse engineering good solutions from great fakes that were generated by AI. And we can use AI to do something called sentiment analysis. So this is essentially pattern detection, where we seek out specifically very emotional words, because fake news tends to be kind of, well, it's one of the ways that it draws you in, right, emotionally. So a lot of things like shocking or secret or things like that tends to be more multi-video. And then AI is particularly good at detecting that distinctive pattern where fake news is propagated over social media. So it's almost like a signature. It's very different than how valid news goes. So again, not a panacea, but this old adage that, again, you may be familiar with, and it's not a good one to use now because we do have a lot of fires going on in Canada, but the whole notion of deliberately creating a line of fire so that when the fire reaches it, it stops and it doesn't go any further. This notion that AI can help us fight AI generated fake news. And there are a number of ways of doing this. I won't go into too much detail given the time, but there are some references at the back if you'd like to see and go into it in more detail. So AI, of course, is much better than us in some things. It's much better at than us in terms of looking at large volumes of data and detailed data. So it can analyze videos, it can analyze photos, it can detect differences in lighting. We used to have a really easy way to detect fake videos in that the people didn't blink, but they quickly fixed that. So now they blink quite convincingly, so we can't do that. And that's what AI does best. However, in my recommendation, what I'm really going to emphasize is we need a hybrid approach. We need people and we need AI and we need the tools and technologies from KM and AI. But really, if we can work together, that's going to be the best way to do it. And I'll give you two quick examples and then we'll wrap up the talk. We each have our, humans have certain strengths, AI has certain strengths. One thing that some interesting work that was done by researchers has taken the metaphor or the example of a nutritional label. What if we could have AI go through the reams and reams of online content and flag the ones that are a little bit unproven and provide that to us, much like the information a nutritional label provides us? So I could look at this and say, maple syrup, probably not really good for me health-wise, right? But I can make an informed decision. The ultimate decision is still in the hands of humans, so we don't want to remove that agency. Another very simple example is some of you have this, right? You have protective software on your laptops, and you get red flag warnings if you try to go to what's already been flagged as an unsafe website. Again, we're providing information so that people can make more evidence-based decisions. We're not automatically preventing you from going to these websites. We're not automatically removing content, but we're saying, if we go through the KM cycle, this one is in that category called unproven, potentially risky, maybe fake, maybe misinformation, and that will at least sort of alert you to look into it more. So really the key takeaways, we need very much a multi-pronged and much more comprehensive approach. This is a complex problem that we have. So we do need to increase literacy of any content consumer. KM and AI can provide some good starting points by flagging potential suspicious content, as well as flagging that signature about sharing that looks like it's being shared in that signature way that probably it's not valid content. And then what can we do, just to be more skeptical, especially if the content really intrigues you or pulls you in. Decide about your knowledge claims yourself. And then it's fine to continue living in your filter bubble as long as everyone in there has, they think before they share and they're trying at least sort of nominally to just consider all content as potentially unproven. So there's some references and resources for those who are interested in delving into any of these areas a little bit further. Thank you very much. And I think we have time now for questions. And I see something in the chat, but I think I can't see it. Maybe you can see it?
The chat, I only have access to it. It's
Okay.
just to put your questions in the Q&A. So we do have a question. It's from Naveed. What is the simplest way of verifying the credulity of news, pictures, and video clips on social media?
Yeah, so really the easiest, the least effort, right, is just to Google it and see if, we call it triangulation. We used to say a minimum of 3 different sources and see if it comes up, because actually this happened to me during the pandemic, I'll be quite honest. Early in the pandemic, I saw that wonderful report of swans and dolphins frolicking in the canals of Venice because the people had gone and nature had come back and the air was clean and the water was clean. And, it's benign, right? I mean, no one's asking me for money to save the dolphins, so I wasn't immediately suspicious. So what I did is I Googled it, and the first thing that came up on Google was online scam, showing dolphins so swimming in the canal. No, it's not real. And then they showed that the actual image that I had looked at was not from Venice, and it was from a completely different area in Italy where the dolphins were. So looking at the source, if you don't have a lot of time, you don't have to spend a lot of effort, you can just Google it. And the second thing that most people say to do is to look at the source, like who is who is publishing it? Is it a news article? Is it a journalist? Is it a person? And just Googling or looking at their profile and seeing who they are. That's the quickest.
Excellent. Thank you for that. We have more questions.
Okay.
Okay, so Rosalie has a question, although you did sort of speak about this a bit, but maybe a little bit more on how do you see the literacy component becoming part of a formal education system?
Yes. So, I mean, I'm a university professor, so I'm more right now I'm in the higher education system. So what we do, for example, at McGill, and many universities have this, all students registered at the university have to take an online tutorial on I believe we have one on bullying. Now we have one on sexual harassment. If you don't take the tutorial, which is an online scenario-based thing, this is a bit heavy-handed, I'll grant you. You're not allowed to graduate. You're not allowed to register for courses. They freeze your university account. So that's like the carrot stick. That's a stick of sort of forcing students to do that. We offer information literacy courses. They are not mandatory. You don't get the stick, for that. And I'm not advocating the stick. No. I think it will take time, but if we could introduce it very early on, actually, I saw this anecdotally with my own children when they were in elementary school, the later years, I would say grade 5 or 6. I remember my young son very seriously telling me, Mom, you have to be careful when you take something from the internet and put it in your project report. So he was actually explaining to me how to cite sources, and I was very favorably impressed. I'm like, wow, did you learn this in school? So I think it's, it doesn't have to be a full-blown literacy campaign, like, hitting people over the head with it. But ideally, if we can introduce it at a very young age where people are using, where instructors, educators are showing, fairly young children, like this is how, you're writing a report on a koala bear. Okay, so how are you going to find information? How do you find information online? I think it would be, they're already being taught how to cite. And and that's the other one that's mandatory, I think, plagiarism tutorials, what's plagiarism, what's not plagiarism. So they're already being taught that. And I think the earlier, the better, because by the time you're in university, it's probably too late, and we get all sorts of interesting things like, but I don't have to cite it if it's on the web because that's public. It's available to everyone. Or I don't have to cite it because it was originally in Mandarin and I translated it. You get all these weird made up sort of things, and people just simply don't know. It's not always a malicious, thing. So obviously, but this will take time. This will take time to introduce it. I'm not a big fan of like mandatory or the stick, the carrot would be nice. But also I think when people are receptive, and similarly, there are a lot of these things, but they're all sort of the onus is on the person to find it. So the easier we can make these things available, like, if you could easily find something online and increase your awareness, that would be great. So that's the utopic vision there, is if we could start introducing it.
Maybe we need to make a call to Sesame Street as well, on so that the kids can learn about
There's
fake news.
nothing wrong with making it fun. There are a lot of really fun educational games that are very effective in getting people, and even for adults, like even for us, it'd be fun. The way we do it with our students is we sort of give them things like to teach them about it. We sort of say, which do you think is true, which do you think is not, and why. So a lot of people need this cognitive dissonance. Like you may think you're really good and you're very you're not vulnerable at all, and you need to sometimes shake up older people, let's say, not elementary school students, because they're less open and they're like, yeah, literacy, whatever, yeah, I'm pretty good, I know what I'm doing, and just sort of show something that could easily fool them, and then they're a little more receptive to, okay, all right, so what do you suggest we do?
Absolutely. We have a few more questions here. Actually, two more right here.
Sure.
So that will probably cut it off at that. This one is anonymous. How challenging will the near future be as politicians keep stating that they don't want to hear about the facts and they don't want to be educated, as it will show that they are wrong or spreading the falseness?
Sadly, I don't think that's the near future. I think that's where we're at. We're there, we're there. And many, when I say we, I mean globally, there are many countries where, unfortunately, this is happening. I don't have anything to make you feel better. right now, other than, you know, people are aware of it. We're trying to address it. I don't have time to get in too much into the psychological dimensions of things, but you know, if you have a very strongly held belief or even an attitude, which could include prejudice, stereotypes, all sorts of things, all research to date since we started looking at this phenomenon shows that it is very difficult to change that belief. And providing scientific facts are not going to do it. And we saw this during the pandemic. You know, if someone is convinced that the vaccine is a way of introducing a chip so that the government can track you, it's almost impossible. It's really difficult. These are very ingrained beliefs, and you know, I don't have too much time to get into psychology of it. So yes, it's. I mean, I guess the small good news is it's not the majority necessarily, you know, and perhaps we can't dislodge it completely, but we can perhaps contain it. Hence the notion of inoculation, contamination, preventing the spreading of it, at least flagging it. But there are a lot of, you know, psychological variables involved in there that are, it's very hard to do. Yeah. And yes, and I see there's one other question, which is gloom and doom. Oh yeah, that's a tough one. I'm the eternal optimist. I always was very annoyed by, like, I love science fiction, and I'm always annoyed by the science fiction movies where at the end, you know, AI destroys humanity and we're gone. That's it. And is everything swimming along? So I tend to be an optimist. I think, yes, all sorts of things can happen. But if you look at the way in which it works, so AI tends to do really well, as I said earlier, on huge volumes of data, but that data exists, right? So it's historical data, and it's garbage in, garbage out. If the data is bad, then it will do things that are bad. But I still think we're far ways away from sentient, conscious AI deciding to destroy its creators. But, you know, the glass is always half full for me, so I'm not the best person to ask about the doom and gloom.
Oh, it would only take a few seconds to get there, right? Anyways, on that note, thanks very much for this presentation. We'll have to end this one because we've got one right after this that people can join and meet us for that. All right, thanks again. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.